Welcome to the Semi-Related Podcast. My name is Jacob Eischen, and I'm here today with Priscilla Peters and Scott Dismuke, and we're here to talk about driver recruitment and driver retention. How are y'all doing today?
We're doing great.
Doing good.
What brings you to the big city of Dallas today?
We are here for the Women in Trucking Conference.
Awesome.
Yes, so it's a great conference. I mean,
It's my first time. Very impressed. Yeah. It's 1,900 people. Mm-hmm. It's a pretty large conference. So yeah, excited to see what we can learn.
And Scott, I think we were talking before we were on camera how excited you are to be here in Dallas. You were learning a little bit more about history, getting to see some of the sites.
Well, I am a little bit of a history nerd. You can't see behind, but like Dealey Plaza is right here behind, so I'm kind of geeking out a little bit to see the
kind of.
Okay, more than kind of. So Dealey Plaza. We're recording this relatively close to the anniversary of the JFK assassination. So yeah, I'm a little geeked out. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, let's start with Priscilla. Do you want to tell us a little bit about your background and then dive into conversion as well?
Yeah, so I've been in the transportation industry for about 26 years. I'm aging myself. Always on the driver recruitment side of things. Specifically, driver recruitment advertising is really what I've spent most of my career in. I started out working for a carrier out of Little Rock. I'm from Little Rock, Arkansas. Flatbed carrier Maverick Transportation. I don't know if you're familiar with them, but that was my first job out of college. Somehow I convinced them I knew a little bit about marketing and advertising. I did not. But they hired me and took a chance on me, and I learned so much there. And then from that, moved to working for an ad agency that specializes in driver recruitment advertising. So since then, I've worked with carriers of all sizes on recruiting drivers, and now we partner with PDA on the retention side of things. So that's really been exciting to kind of add that to what we do. So I lead marketing at Conversion Interactive Agency. And what we do is, at the end of the day, we help people hire drivers and keep them. And we do that through strategy and all sorts of things, but really focused on technology and how recruitment technology has really changed. We've evolved into, ultimately now we really are a technology company. So yeah, it's exciting. Thanks for inviting us to kind of hang out today.
Yeah, happy to have you. And then Scott, if you want to do the same, give a little bit about your background and then dive into what PDA is and what your role is there.
Sure. So my background's a little bit different. So I did not come from the transportation industry. I had come from mass communications, public relations, government relations. Did some work for the federal government and the political side of things that we don't have to get into. But I did a little work on some transportation issues in that time. A lot of time alternative fuel work, things of that nature. And then back in 2015, got involved with PDA. So basically, had very little experience in the trucking industry. My first day on the job at PDA, I went to truck driving school. So spent my first 3 weeks of employment at truck driving school. So I really got baptized by fire on that side of things. So really at PDA, what we do is we help companies from a retention standpoint. The main thing that we do is collect data directly from conversations with drivers. We have 2 offices, one in Nashville, one in Van Buren, Arkansas. Our employees are literally talking to drivers every single day. Just helping them navigate issues that they're having. We escalate issues to companies if a driver's kind of an imminent quit situation. And so during that time, we're collecting data on what the drivers are saying, the issues that they're facing. And so we really try to help them keep those drivers in the truck. And then we put out our data reports with conversion to kind of give quarterly feedback on what those drivers are saying and the issues that they're dealing with.
Okay. And then, tell me a little bit more about this partnership between Conversion and PDA.
Yeah, so one of the things we realized is we have all of the data on the recruiting side of things. So we always say from the click to the hire, we have all of that data. So from the time a potential driver clicks on your ad all the way through whatever process and journey he or she goes through to get into your truck. And then we work with, we knew about PDA, we're a sister company, and so we thought, why are we not tying our data together? Like, this doesn't really make sense. And so now when we do your recruitment advertising, you get all of that data, but then you get the retention data. And what that ends up doing is it ends up being you being able to see the entire journey. And so it really does make an impact. And so you can see not only what happens on the front end, but is what we're doing on the front end really helping you retain the guys or gals once that you hire them. And so I think it's been really great. And now I know you guys are doing a lot of other things I'm sure we'll talk about, but just to give them that full picture. We always say from click to hire and beyond is really now what we're able to provide since we partner with PDA.
Yeah, so tell me a little bit about this partnership. I know you all have kind of put this data together, packaged it into these nice couple of reports. Will you tell me what those reports are, and then we could start to dive into some of those trends after as well?
Yeah, sure. So we do a quarterly data download, and basically it's recruitment marketing data that we get from the field, if you will, like what's going on in the driver market, basically. And then Scott, you maybe talk about
so kind of what I was saying earlier. So during our conversations, we do the quarterly reports, we do an annual report every year. So we collect all of the data from our conversation during a quarter. We put it all together. We give specifics, what specifically are drivers talking about. The way we work our data is we start with a core issue. So we talk about equipment, we talk about compensation, but those are really broad areas, right? And so what we want to be able to do is we want to be able to tell a carrier what about. So what about compensation specifically as a driver talking about? Because if you're going to make a data-informed decision, you can't just say you have a compensation problem, because a lot of companies immediately gravitate towards pay rate. And that's not always the case. I've got 5 years worth of data that says drivers complain more about miles than they do about pay rate. And so the data we provide, and we want to provide in these reports, is we want to get really down to the details of this. So we can let companies know, we can let the industry know specifically what a driver's talking about.
And then we also do the driver survey. And so we do those twice a year, one in the spring, one in the fall. And really what we do is we do a short survey, and we always have really great response. Yeah. Normally over 1,000 drivers respond. And we're able to actually say what they think about things that are going on in the market. So for example, and I'm sure we'll talk about this, but we asked them just in our fall survey that we just released, what do you think about, do you think this freight market's going to turn around? How optimistic are you feeling about that? So we just ask them things, how do you prefer to be recruited? Things like that, so that we can take that back to carriers and anyone who's hiring or trying to retain drivers. But the driver survey is probably, I would say, our most downloaded piece of content that folks kind of hang on to for a while. And we do that twice a year in the spring and the fall.
Yeah, and that, as you both have mentioned, is the core of the business, right? I mean, the world runs on these drivers, everything moves through them and thanks to them. So you want to dive into some of those results and tell us a little bit about what we're kind of seeing in that driver market and what these drivers are saying?
Yeah, sure. You want
Yeah, let's go for it. So I guess in the survey, the first question that we ask, and we ask this on every survey, is, are you currently looking for a job? And the one that we just released was actually the lowest. It was like 33%, I believe, that said that they were not looking for a job. Or that they were looking for a job. That's the lowest that we have seen. It was about 0.5% lower than it was in the spring. Now, if you go year over year, back in the spring or the fall of last year, it was about 40% of the drivers said that they were looking for a job. And so one of the things that we noticed about that, because we asked 2 follow-up questions based on their answer on that first question. So if you answered yes, you were looking, why are you looking? If you said no, why aren't you looking? So the ones that said that they were looking, it's really looking at that kind of work-life balance. They're looking for stable miles, but they're also looking for better home time. They kind of want that work-life balance. That's kind of why they're looking. The ones that said they're not looking, that was like 33%. And the interesting thing about that is, if you look at the data, it's a really soft 33%. Because when you dig into that, of those drivers, of that 33% said that they weren't looking, they said like 60% of them said because, or no, it wasn't 60%. I think it was lower than that they were afraid to make a move in this economy. I think that was more like 14%. That was actually up 5%, that they were afraid to make a move in this economy from the spring. The others were looking, saying that they just needed more experience. So it was something like half of the drivers that said that they weren't looking because they were afraid to make a move in the economy or they needed more experience. So we know in the trucking industry, kind of that 6-month mark of experience is really when it kind of opportunities open up for drivers, for maybe local jobs, things of that nature. And so we know that that segment of drivers in the next 6 months very well could be looking for a job. And then if you look at those that are afraid to make a move in the economy, depending on what the economy does, that too could add to that number of drivers that say they're looking for a job. So I think it's a really soft 33% that said that they weren't looking. And so it'll be interesting to see what happens over the next 6 months to see if that number changes when we do the survey in the spring.
Yeah, we asked them too, like things like, we wanted to know, obviously, because we build out this technology that helps carriers recruit smarter, and we wanted to know, what does the driver feel about that technology? Like a lot of times we'll have a carrier say, are you sure that that a driver is going to actually talk to a virtual assistant instead of a human? So we just flat out said, listen, how do you feel about getting your information into a trucking company using this type of technology? And overwhelmingly they said, listen, if that's how we get it to you, that's how we get it to you. If I can't reach a recruiter after hours, then I would love to talk to a virtual assistant, or for you to use AI advanced technology to get the information you need from me to get to that full application. And so that for us was very reassuring, right? Mm-hmm. And so we asked them that data is in the survey. We also asked them things like, what are the apps that you're using the most on your smartphone today? Which overwhelmingly it's YouTube, Facebook. I mean, I was surprised TikTok was a little higher than it had been in the past when we had asked them. I think it was like 21% said that TikTok was one of the top apps that they used. And I mean, I know everyone has opinions about TikTok, but what we always say is, grab your handle, start creating the content and post it on other channels. Like, you don't have to be a TikTok, big user for your brand on TikTok. But at the end of the day, vertical video formats do very well when it comes to recruiting. So drivers are consuming that type of content at a very high rate. And so if you're not posting that in somewhere, Facebook, Instagram, obviously, I mean, YouTube was like at 50-something percent. Mm-hmm. I mean, it's really high. It was the highest app that they said that they used the most on their smartphone. And so I think that, at the end of the day, when you look at that data that came back from our perspective on the driver survey, it just reinforces the whole idea of you have to have this comprehensive strategy when you're going after drivers. We also asked them about, we're big on employer brand, and I know that's like, of course you are, you're the marketing person. But at the end of the day, your employee value proposition is super important. Like, what are you selling to drivers in the market? And honestly, diesel techs, and there's other positions that folks are struggling to hire in as well today with the labor market the way it is. And so we asked them, like, do you prefer to be familiar with a company before you apply to work for them? And they said that they were. There was a handful that said, I don't have to be familiar, but most of them said, I prefer to know them. And so it's that whole idea of being in the digital world, in digital and social media, showing up in the moments that count, so you build that brand preference with drivers so that when they are ready, like Scott said, when only 30% of them, 33% of them today are looking for a job, but we know that number is soft because, what he was saying before, when they are looking, they're like, oh, I remember I saw that funny video ABC Trucking did. That seems like a cool company to work for. And then I just saw their ad with the job description, so maybe I want to click on that. So you have to just think about, what is that journey? And the driver survey results really kind of supported a lot of that, which I thought was, it's good for us. We always look at that data and say, okay, we need to shift here because maybe this isn't the way that we need to go. But this round, it kind of reinforced a lot of the stuff that we were doing.
Yeah, and Priscilla even noted, too, talking about the question we asked about the freight market. And that, I'll be honest with you, that was one of the questions I was a little surprised at the results, because it was something like 56% of the drivers said that they were optimistic that the freight market was going to rebound or turn around soon. And you go back to the beginning of the year, had a lot of people making predictions about, okay, well, we think it'll come back in the third quarter, and then, well, maybe more the fourth quarter, and the kind of a typical holiday bounce. And now it's, okay, maybe the end of the first quarter of 2024, or maybe a little more towards the middle of the year. And I just think that, we've gone through so much as a country economically over the last few years with COVID and the freight boom that happened with COVID. It was unlike anything that at least I know I've ever seen, and probably you've ever seen too. And so I think it was kind of uncharted waters. It was just amazing what was going on. And now we've kind of come back to earth. And I'm not sure this is following atypical. If you look historically, most freight recessions are 18 to 22 months. And I'm not, we're kind of at the end of that. If you look at historically a freight recession, usually we're kind of in that time frame. But I'm not so sure that that's going to happen this time. And so everything that I'm reading, everything we're hearing, everybody's like, I'm not sure, But the drivers, like I said, 56% of them said yes. They're optimistic that the freight recession is going to come to an end soon. Now, we didn't ask them to define soon, but I thought that was a very interesting thing. One of the big takeaways for me on the survey, I think both from a recruiting and from a retention standpoint, is really, I think, the importance that drivers place on work-life balance. I think as our workforce ages and we really try to focus on bringing in a younger generation into the trucking industry, I think that is going to become more prominent even, because I think as you look at the younger generation of drivers that are coming in, that work-life balance is more and more important, that home time, that time with family. So if you look at some of the results of this, I think you see a lot of those from a driver priority standpoint that we ask in several of the questions. Stuff like benefits, health benefits, saving for retirement, buying a new home. A lot of those things are very, very important to drivers. And I think from a carrier standpoint, what we're going to have to do as an industry, if we're going to attract a younger generation of drivers into the industry, is we're going to have to look at that and figure out, okay, how do we balance moving our freight, but also making sure that we get drivers home, whether that's weekly, during the weekends, through the house 2 or 3 times a week. How are we going to balance that as an industry? We had Bob Costello on our podcast back during the summer, and I asked him the question, are the days of that traditional OTR driver, are they over? And he didn't really think that they were, but I do think that as an industry, we're going to have to start shifting to more of a regional model about how we, regional model, relays, you take this freight to here, another driver is going to pick it up because we got to get this driver pointed back home. So I think we're going to have to look at an industry of how we're doing that, because the demographics are going to change. We even see the demographics in our survey. It was something like 50% of the drivers that responded to our survey were over the age of, 40 years old. So we know it's not a secret that the workforce is aging in the trucking industry from a driver standpoint. So we've got to bring in new drivers. We have a driver shortage. The only way to do that is we have to become more attractive to the younger generation. And I think to do that, we're going to have to look at how we operate as an industry.
Yeah, and as Priscilla mentioned earlier, I think technology is going to play a huge role in that. I mean, you see all of these changes in trends and what platforms these drivers are engaging with and where they're spending their time. So how do you see that playing into retention as well? And then, like you mentioned, attracting this next generation of talent and assuring them that this is a good market, as well as the expectations that are changing. As you mentioned, this change from an over-the-road truck driver who may spend, weeks out on the road to these regional carriers, or as you mentioned, relays. Kind of what are the trends you're seeing there?
Well, I think from a technology standpoint, and I think Priscilla and I are going to come at this 2 different ways when we're looking at technology. For technology, I think it's a real tricky balance right now because of kind of the way the workforce sits up from a driver standpoint. Most of the communication now that goes to drivers is really through an onboard communication device. And so we have a set of an older generation of drivers who don't like to do it electronically. They like the phone. And if you go back to some of our previous surveys, most drivers prefer that phone communication. Now, I think that has a lot to do with the fact that you're dealing with the segment of the population who works isolated on a day in and day out basis. So that personal touch, that interaction with somebody on the other line is really important to them. But having said that, going back to what I was just saying on the younger generation, they're used to being on their phones and texting and going back and forth. Most of the communication I have with my 20-year-old son who's at college, I don't pick up the phone and call him anymore, we text. And so I think we're going to have to kind of balance that, at least during this time frame, because we have an older generation that wants to be on the phone, we have a younger generation that's used to communicating electronically. And so from a retention standpoint, I think the important thing is to know your driver population, know what their preferences are. What we tell companies all the time from a retention standpoint is communicate with your drivers in the same way in which they communicate with you. If they call you, call them back. If they're sending you a message via that onboard communication device, then respond that way. So you're going to have to know that driver population in a way that you're going to communicate the way that's the most effective with that individual driver. And so I think from a retention standpoint, the technology question is going to be a little more of a nuanced balance game between what is the demographic of your driving population.
And I think too, it's really important. A lot of times people think, oh, technology, we're going to lose the personal touch. But the way that we've seen it be really successful is that carriers are implementing the technology more on the front end of the recruiting side of things. So in other words, I get a short form and from a driver, and maybe I just have his name and a few bits of information to know that he's quote unquote pre-qualified. But then I've got to get all this other information to get his full application so that I can hire him. Let the technology get that for you. So we have a product called Lead Assist. It takes you through, it's advanced AI automation that just does that workflow behind the scenes, nurtures the driver to get all the information they need to get that full application and get that in your applicant tracking system. Now, if the technology is doing that side of it, then your recruiters can really be nurturing all of those full apps. And hey, Jacob, you're coming to orientation next week. We've got you. Here's your offer. Here's your, hire letter, if you will. Make sure that you book your rental car or your bus or however, really nurture that, because we know there's a no-show rate issue in the industry. We know there's a lot of these things. So that back end of the recruiting side of things you can put more of your human assets, if you will, on that end of things and really let the technology work for you. And it marries itself really well. The drivers are fine with it, and the recruiting departments, that's when I really think they begin to do better, because that back end of it is the side of the process that can be really tough. And so the technology can get you to the Holy Grail. So of the full app being the Holy Grail, if you will. But I always just say, don't think you're going to lose the personal touch. Matter of fact, your recruiters are going to be able to your point, be on the phone with the driver that you already know. You've got all of his full app. He's completely qualified. You're ready to offer him the job. Let your recruiter really focus on that part of the nurturing. So I don't know. I just think it's important to note that both sides, you can do both with technology.
Yeah, and I think something you both touched on there was where technology ends and where the human aspect begins, right? What are some trends or best practices? I know you both kind of touched on it, but let's zoom in a little bit more on how we can better serve these drivers through these automated experiences as well as human experiences, and kind of having that personal touch on that in between. Yeah,
I think Scott's point about really contacting them or responding to them in how it comes in. A lot of times we'll have a client that, it's a very traditional recruiting department where most of the recruiters are working from the phones, which that's great, don't get me wrong. But if you're doing a lot of recruiting on social media, consider having a social media recruiter, that's all they do. Just another way to actually create that open dialogue with drivers from a technology standpoint when you need to. That's something that I would really say. And then I would also, I think that, and you can speak to this a lot more than I can, but that window of time from when you offer the guy the job and he gets assigned the truck and in the truck, and probably that first 2 weeks, that is critical. And so the nurturing part of making sure he actually shows up, or she shows up for orientation, gets in the truck, at assignment, the truck is what it needs to be, that it's not I know you could speak to that. That part of it is huge.
Yeah, so, it's really interesting kind of going back to the balance between technology and personal touch. I think from a retention standpoint, one of the most important things is relationship with your driver. Because if that driver feels like a number, the minute they have a problem, they're not going to stick around. That's one of the things that we really focus on at PDA, is helping bridge that gap between the relationship gap between the carrier and the driver. We really focus, like on what Priscilla said, on that first 6 months of employment. And so that we believe in that personal touch. That's why we're on the phone every day. That's why we're calling drivers every day. We're developing relationships. We're bridging that gap between the carrier and the driver. Because at the end of the day, that relationship and the personal relationship that a carrier has with a driver is ultimately going to determine how long a driver gives a carrier before there's a problem, or when there's a problem. There's not before, it's when there is a problem. So if there's a relationship there, and we can, you can look at that even outside of the driver carrier relationship. That's true anywhere. The better the relationship, the better chance that person's going to stick around to see through whatever that problem is. And so I think the real key with retention is technology is a big deal. You can use technology. We use technology from the standpoint of our data portal, so our customers can see what their drivers are saying. That's the technology side of it for us from a data standpoint. But it doesn't erase the ability to have that personal touch, to be talking to drivers, to be helping them walk through whatever issue it is, whether it's work related, or more importantly, if you look at any of our termination data, personal issues are a big deal. And so even personal issues, whether they're issues at home or just loneliness, missing their families, that personal touch cannot be replaced by technology from a retention standpoint.
Yeah, and we talk about how important that handoff is, right, from the recruiting side of things to retention. Can we kind of talk through what is some of the biggest challenges in those first 6 months for a driver, right? Whenever they get into that truck for the first time and have to talk to dispatch for the first time, go on their first load, and what that whole experience is like. What all are you seeing on that front as well?
Well, from our end on the recruiting side of things, one of the main things that we see is, and I know we're talking about after they're hired, but if you're not honest with the driver, even if your pay isn't better than the pay of another carrier that he's looking for, like, the honesty element is more valuable than for you to sell something that you actually don't deliver on. And that's what the drivers tell us all the time. In our survey data over the past few years, it's been, when we ask anything about, tell us about the recruiting process, what do you think about it? Well, they lie to me. They're not honest. They're selling me something they're not delivering on. So I think once they get hired, if what you sold them is not what you're delivering on, it will never work. And so I just think from the recruiting end, you have to really almost do an audit for yourself as a carrier. Is what I'm selling what I'm actually delivering? And if it's not, how do I change the way I'm selling it to actually tell the driver the true story? And then I know you have lots of data on this.
Yeah, we're kind of hitting my soapbox territory. So there's a couple things here. First, I think we have to, when we talk about the first 6 months and we talk about the recruiting process, we have to look really at how we hire drivers within the industry. It's different than anywhere else. It's even different than how we hire people within our own carriers. When I hire people at my office, when Priscilla hires people at her office, we're meeting those people face to face. We're probably interviewing them 2 or 3 times. We're taking them out to lunch. We decide to hire them. We're meeting them at the front door when they come in. We're introducing them to everybody. We're helping that person develop a relationship with the people that they're going to be working with on a daily basis, right? With drivers, they're on the phone with somebody that 9 times out of 10 they never meet, that's going to hire them in a recruiter. We bring them in for orientation for 2 or 3 days. We feed them water through a fire hose with information of all the stuff we expect them to remember, right? All of our company policies, all of our standard operating procedures. This is how you do this. This is how you do that. We throw them a set of keys and we shove them out the door so they can go, log miles. 9 times out of 10, they're not meeting their fleet manager, the person that's going to be their direct go-to. And so we expect them, after those 2 or 3 days with no relationship anywhere, to know how to handle everything. And so that's how we start them off. Again, it goes back to what I've already talked about in the importance of that relationship side of things, right? So we already kind of put them in a tough position. And I understand that. They want to move. That's how they make money. We want them to move. That's how the company makes money. So that's really the condition that we're putting them in. So that personal relationship, again, is a big deal. One of the things that we see, one of the most important things that we see for those first 6 months is what is the status of the equipment after that driver comes out of orientation, okay? We have a lot of clients where we track that data. We call it equipment assignment issues. And what the equipment assignment is it's the company's first impression that they make on a driver, right? So this truck is going to be the driver's work. It's going to be the driver's home. Whether they're staying out for 5 days or whether they're staying out for 14 days, this is where they're spending a majority of their time. And so what we have seen with companies that had a really short tenure of drivers who were voluntarily leaving is we would look at that data, and a lot of that started with trouble with the truck at the time of assignment. So here you have carriers who are investing a lot of money in recruiting these drivers. They're spending thousands to tens of thousands of dollars to advertise, to travel in a driver, to put them through orientation, to put them up in a hotel, to feed them during orientation. You get them out, and the first thing they do is they go out to a truck with a check engine light, a dead battery. The truck doesn't start. The previous driver's belongings are still in the truck. That, and you go back to a couple of surveys ago that we did, when we asked drivers, what does the condition of your truck at assignment mean to you? And with them, it was all about respect. It said, it tells us how a company feels about me as a driver. And so one of the most important things that you can do is give a driver a clean, detailed, inspected, and working truck, because that's going to be their livelihood. That's how you want them to make money. That's how you want them to make you money. So the worst thing you could do is give them a piece of junk truck. And so we've seen that in our data a lot, that's one of the most important things. Going back to what Priscilla said, the recruitment process of saying what you'll do and then actually following through with it, that really comes true at home time. So we know a lot of drivers, we've seen that really even more of a shift after COVID of the importance of drivers wanting daily jobs. They want home daily at some point during the day. Obviously, not every driver can have a home daily job. What I would tell you is when you tell a driver you will get them home, get them home. If you can't get them home, tell them why. Tell them why. Explain to them why. Because if you just say, sorry, it's not going to happen, well, that driver looks at that as a respect. At least have the decency to give them the honest answer is, I can't get you home because of A, B, or C. I'm sorry, we'll get you home immediately, as quick as we possibly can. The other thing I would say that's important in the first 6 months is make the drivers a part of the planning process. So one of the things we hear from drivers all the time is, I got assigned a load that was only 150 miles. It's a waste of my time to do a 150-mile load. Well, what the driver doesn't understand is the fleet manager and the planners have that lined up to where there's that 150 miles is going to get them to a load that's a 500-mile load. Well, they don't tell the driver that. They just say, here's a 150-mile load. We need you to take it from here to here. We'll use here as a great example. If you have a driver that's in Dallas and they say, hey, I've got a load for you to Fort Worth, do I really want to go sit in this traffic and do all of that? But what they don't know is that in Fort Worth, there's a load that's going to take them to San Francisco. Well, make a driver a part of that process, right? So let the driver know, hey, I'm going to have you take this over to Fort Worth, because when you get in Fort Worth, there's a trailer there that we'll have you take to San Francisco. If the driver knows that that is just taking them to San Francisco, I guarantee you they're going to be much more apt to take that short load to Fort Worth. And so I think one of the things that's important is communicate with that driver, let them be part of the planning process. Again, it makes them feel a part of the team. It lets them know what's going on. It eases their mind that there's a plan, that they're going forward. So equipment assignment, communication, make drivers feel like they're part of the planning process, keeping them involved so they know what they're doing.
Yeah, and then building on top of that, so we've kind of touched on equipment and compensation a little bit there as well. Do you want to go through and talk about what the order of these, the feedback from drivers you see is? You know, it's equipment, compensation, and then where does the list kind of go from there?
It goes to operations after that, and that's usually, you know, with the exception of Q4 of last year, it's always equipment, compensation, and then operations. Q4 of last year, actually compensation topped equipment for the first and only time to this point. So yeah, so really equipment. When I look at equipment issues, and I tell carriers this all the time, it's really about controlling what you can control. You can't keep a truck from breaking down. It's going to happen. What you can control is what we've already talked about. What does that truck look like when you assign it right out of orientation? And to some degree, minus the COVID shortages, you can to some degree control how long that driver either stays in the shop or you get that driver into a loaner if one's available. So with equipment issues, it doesn't always surprise me that those are top. You've got thousands and thousands and thousands of trucks on the road. They're going to break down. You're going to have tires go out. Things like that are going to happen. So when I'm looking at an individual carrier's data, I'm looking, okay, tractor issues are almost always number one. So where's equipment assignment and where's general maintenance? If general maintenance issues are really, really high, then we have drivers who are breaking down a lot and they're complaining about being in the shop too much. So we need to look at that. So that's really what I look at from an equipment standpoint. From a compensation standpoint, again, goes back to anytime you ask driver, do you want to make more money? Anytime you ask anybody if they want to make more money, they're all going to say yes. And so what we look at there is, why are drivers talking about it? The thing that we've seen over the last year with the freight recession is drivers talking about miles or lack thereof. It's really inconsistent loads or loads not available. That's the thing that we're hearing the most right now. That does usually bleed over into pay rate. If you look at our data for Q3, when we look at the top 10 reasons drivers voluntarily left in Q3 this year, pay rate was the top issue. And a lot of carriers have been like, well, wait, I've been raising pay. Carriers have been raising pay over the industry. All true. But what that does point to is the freight recession again. Drivers aren't making what they expect. So they're going to look at pay rate. They're also going to look at the lack of miles. So that's usually kind of the balance that I look at from a compensation. From an operations standpoint, it's all about communication. It's all about communication. The biggest thing that we hear the most, and we've already talked about this a little bit, is drivers complaining about no response or a slow response from their driver manager. And again, we've already touched on that, but that's usually where things break down. When you look at it, yes, drivers care about home time. Yes, drivers care about parking. All of those things certainly matter. But when the things that we're consistently hearing, those are really kind of the top things that we hear about.
Yeah, and then in this market specifically, so I was looking at the ATRI's operational cost of trucking report from 2008 to 2022. Costs have gone up 36% starting in about 2020. So 2008 to 2020, they're nearly flat, but the last couple of years we've seen this huge rise. So how are driver recruitment and driver retention affecting these costs, and what are some ways that carriers can avoid this this cost in a broader sense, so on the recruitment and retention side?
Yeah, I think from a recruiting standpoint, the traditional, what we would call cost per hire, is lower right now just because demand isn't quite as high because we are in a freight recession right now. However, what we've seen and over the 26 years that I talked about earlier being in the industry is we know when it comes back that everyone's going to all of a sudden need drivers today, right? Mm-hmm. And so what we've been really trying to coach a lot of carriers through is be careful not to cut your pipeline off. Like, you might be full or close to full right now, or you might even be in a position where you're getting rid of some of your lower 10% that aren't performing as well as you would need them to just in the current freight market that we're in. But we know when freight rebounds that soft number of drivers that said they weren't looking today, now they have the experience, now the economy's better, they're going to start moving. So your turnover rates are going to go up, and your need for drivers is also going to go up, which means the cost to hire those is going to go up. If you have sustained some sort of what we call top of funnel awareness presence with drivers throughout this freight market, you're going to pay less to hire a driver from an advertising and marketing standpoint than you would if you did not, because you're going to have to make up all of that ground. And so, we have data that shows those who've bought into that philosophy in the past, it has really paid off. We had clients that just cut everything off. When COVID hit, it was like, oh, we cut it off. And it literally took them almost 12 months when that huge freight rebound came back to come back from that in their driver pipeline. So I think from a cost standpoint, today, it's not, the cost per hire isn't as high, but as freight comes back, it will. And if you're sustaining your pipeline now, it's going to really help from a cost perspective for sure. It's all supply and demand game on the recruiting side of things.
And I think from a retention standpoint, I think one of the things we see from carriers a lot is they know how much it costs to bring in a driver. They know that cost per hire. I think one of the things that's important from a retention standpoint when you're talking cost, we know what it takes to bring in, but what does it mean to lose? How much does it cost to lose? What is that in lost revenue? What is that in that truck sitting on that fence? So what is the all-in cost to bringing in / losing a driver? And that's one of the things that we're constantly talking about from a retention standpoint, because I'm going to just be really blunt with you right now. When you're in this kind of a market, drivers care less about retention, right? There's not as much freight, so if a driver leaves, well, that's just more freight for the drivers that are staying. Well, that's all, I get that, I understand that, but at the end of the day, what does that mean to you? Because when this does come back, if it matches historical trends, it's going to come back pretty quickly, relatively quickly. Not like bad today, good tomorrow, but it's going to come back pretty quickly. So then we're going to start caring about retention again. And so what are those cost savings? Anytime, even if it's just one driver, even if it's just keeping that driver an extra 90 days, what does that mean? And so I know a lot of companies know how long do I have to keep a driver before I break even. But I think right now, the more drivers that you can keep in your truck, the more time and energy that you're spending on keeping those drivers in your truck now, you're going to make it a lot easier for yourself when this does rebound. Because if you're just kind of have that laissez-faire attitude right now of, well, if I lose a driver, I lose a driver, it at least gives more miles for the drivers that are sticking around. When this does rebound, you're gonna be in a bind. So I would be hoarding as many drivers as I could right now that are currently in my truck to make life easier for myself when this does rebound, end of this year, first of next year, whenever it does rebound.
Yeah, and then you talked about that top 10 reasons that drivers voluntarily leave. How has that changed along with the freight cycles?
Well, it's really been interesting because when I went back historically and looked at that, even pre-COVID, equipment issues were up there because drivers are having that. And one of the things we've seen about equipment that's different from any other issue that we track is equipment issues almost always cascade into other problems. It usually means a compensation problem or a home time problem. Because if a driver's in the shop and they miss a home time, or the driver's in the shop and they're not logging miles. So that's one thing we see is that this week's equipment problem a lot of times becomes next week's compensation problem. And so equipment and compensation issues are always kind of up there. What we've seen in the last probably 2 to 3 quarters is equipment issues are still up there, but we're seeing more drivers complaining about inconsistent loads and loads not available, about pay rate. We're really seeing that up there a lot. The other issue that we see that we look at from a retention standpoint is kind of a low-hanging fruit is payroll errors. So if you look at our overall data, if I'm going through all of our overall data with you, you don't see payroll errors stick out a lot. But what you do see is it does stick out in our voluntary quit data, because that obviously is a big deal, because the first thing that a driver thinks of when they think that something's wrong with their check, the first thing they think immediately is, well, the carrier is just trying to screw me over. And that's not always the case. So that's one of the issues that when we're talking to a driver, we immediately get that in front of the carrier, because it's usually a pretty easy fix. One of two things has happened. Either the driver has not scanned documents in, and so they thought a trip they did this week was going to be on this week's paycheck, and it wasn't. Or they missed payroll cutoff. There's usually a pretty easy explanation for it. Or it truly is a paycheck error, and the company can then fix that pretty quickly. Now, one of the things that we see a lot with paycheck errors is the driver or the company will say, well, we'll put it on next week's check. Don't do that. Don't do that, because if you're at a company and you're doing anything but driving right now and the company screws up your paycheck, they're going to fix it right then. They're not going to tell you to wait a week. But that's what we seem to tell drivers a lot when we screw up, is we'll fix it next week. Well, if you go and look at the data on this survey, most of the drivers are saying one of their top concerns are paying their bills every month. So if they have to skip, if there's something wrong with the paycheck, and maybe they missed a $500 trip in there, and you're telling them to wait next week, that's missed rent, that's groceries, that's prescription meds. So if you do mess up, fix it right then. So that's one of the things we've seen from a compensation standpoint that's really a pretty low-hanging fruit to fix. So really the things that we've seen fluctuate the most over the last year are strictly freight related. It's pay issues, it's miles issues, it's loads not available, it's waiting to be loaded or unloaded. All of those things that affect the driver's ability to log miles, that's what we've seen really kind of climb up the list of issues that drivers are having that are causing them to leave.
And I'm seeing a common thread through a lot of these issues, right? It's this communication aspect as well as a sense of urgency. How quickly can we resolve this issue, and how well do we communicate the issue and the solution plan? What are some other edge cases you're seeing outside of, like, payroll errors is a great example, that are affecting drivers?
Well, you have to have the ability to quickly identify and quickly intervene. If you don't know what drivers are having problems, you can't intervene. If you can't intervene, you're not going to be able to fix it. So those two things, quickly identify, quickly intervene. We talked about one, we talked about the equipment issues. If you've got a driver that's in the shop all the time, get them in a loaner. You got to keep a driver moving. The driver's, what is it? It's pay per mile for the most part. Pay per mile, keep them moving. If there's equipment issues, keep them moving. We talked about the communication. You have to have that constant communication. You have to be able to proactively talk to your drivers. If you're not proactively talking, then you're reacting to their issues. If you're proactively talking to them, you can get in front of whatever issue it is. Those are the things that we're seeing a lot of. I was trying to think if there was any other really kind of standout issues that we hear from drivers a lot. That would really help from a retention standpoint, but a lot of it is going to come back to communication at the end of the day, regardless of what the issue is. Mm-hmm. It's going to come back to communication.
Okay. And then, Priscilla, what are you seeing carriers are investing so much into recruitment, whether it be advertising, their marketing, their social presence, these recruiters they have? How do they tie recruiter success and retention success? And then how do those two work hand in hand?
Yeah, so one of the things that PDA is just getting ready to roll out is they offer a recruiter scorecard. So again, we know that we have this data on the front end. We know how we follow all of that data for how the lead comes in, if it's qualified, all of that. And then once they hire the driver, then they're able to say, wow, Susie, recruiter, a lot of her drivers stay. She must really be telling the right story. And so they offer a scorecard or, Scott, recruiter Scott, he needs some work.
I do. I need a lot of work.
He needs some work. His aren't staying. So that's one way to measure that kind of recruitment success. We also do it by source. So you might be getting a lot of hires from a particular media source, could be anything, and then PDA can track that through their data and say, you know what, all these hires that we're getting from this source are not quality hires. They're not staying, they don't work for whatever reason in our culture at our carrier. So that's another way too. But I think the recruiter scorecard is kind of a cool thing.
Yeah, I mean the great thing with the recruiter scorecard is it's going to allow companies, again, to look at kind of the turnover percentage based upon that that individual recruiter, but you can also go in and see the data behind that. So why is that important? And I was literally just talking to a carrier about this last week, and their response was, well, I don't want to pick on recruiters. That's the great thing about our scorecard is that recruiter may have a high turnover percentage, but you're going to be able to go in and look at the data behind that and see, okay, maybe we have a situation where there was 10 data points for that recruiter that had to do with equipment issues. Well, guess what? There's not a thing that recruiter can do about a truck breaking down, right? But if you go in there and look and see that you had 15 drivers that complained about they were unclear or they didn't understand their pay rate, that's a teaching moment now for that recruiter. You can go in, you can maybe listen to those phone calls, and you can say, how are we selling our pay rate through this recruiter? Or if you see 15 data points where the driver says they felt like it was dishonest or they were misled, again, teachable moment there. We're doing the same thing with fleet managers to have a fleet manager scorecard. So again, you can go in and you can look from an individual fleet manager standpoint what the turnover is, and then we can look and see, okay, let's look at those data points. Do we have a situation where we have a bunch of equipment issues? Driver can't, or the fleet manager really can't fix that. But if we see a lot of communication issues, a lot of slow or no response, then we know, okay, again, teachable moment, we can go in and we can fix those issues with that individual fleet manager or recruiter.
Yeah, and I think you're doing a good job of diving deeper into that identify and then intervene idea. So tell me about, as data providers, some of the benefits and use cases and some of these stories you're seeing as, like you mentioned with this recruiter, say they have a high turnover rate due to equipment, being able to dig into that data and see the true story behind it. Kind of tell us about how that's being empowered through conversion and PDA.
Well, I know for us, the good thing about our data is it's real time. So as drivers are having issues, carriers can monitor their data. They can look at it however, they can look at it daily, they can look at it weekly, however they choose to do it. But you still have to do it, right? You still have to get into the data. The data doesn't mean anything if you don't use it. Mm-hmm. And so the one thing we've seen from the carriers that are most successful with our programs is, number one, they're in the data. Number two, they use the data. And then number three, on an individual level, when we escalate drivers to them, they take those issues and they either fix or address. Because even with drivers, a lot of times you don't have to fix an issue. Sometimes a driver just wants to be heard and have those issues addressed. So from our data standpoint, I think the most important thing, again from a technology standpoint, is that our data is in real time. It does give the carrier a daily glimpse if they want one, if they choose to look at it that way, a daily glimpse of what their drivers are dealing with literally on an individual and hour-to-hour basis.
And from our standpoint, on the recruitment side of things, we have a data command center, we call it Lead Link. And what they're able to do is go in and see, okay, how are my individual sources performing from a geographic standpoint? We've seen, like, a good example would be like, we had a carrier who was looking for drivers in this certain little pocket in South Carolina, and we kept going back to the sources and saying, why isn't this performing? When you go and look at the drivers who are in that area, there's not very many drivers in that little pocket of that particular area in South Carolina. So we said, let's open this up geographically a little bit. Let's add 50, 75 miles to that radius and see what happens. Then it begins to perform better. And we can just really drill down and see some things like that. We can see which sources perform better for which driver types in which geographic areas, so that we know from a digital and social media aspect where to actually place your media for the drivers that you need. So that's what we look at from a data perspective. And then also, we have a data community called Fleet Intel. We have a lot of carriers that need to know how do I compete from a driver pay standpoint in the markets where I'm hiring drivers. And what's interesting is, used to, it was pretty blanketed, driver pay was, but now because so many carriers are going more to a regional model, the pay is more regional than it used to be. So this particular data community lets you dig in and see, here the drivers, when I'm going after this market, this is the average weekly advertised pay, because that's what you're competing against. in that particular market, so they can go and look at that. We also have it for diesel techs as well. So we live and breathe by data. I mean, that's kind of what drives everything, our decisions, our strategy, all the things. That's kind of why it was a no-brainer to tie everything together with both of us. So.
Yeah, and then to build on top of that too, I know we're here discussing these reports and there's a lot of emphasis on this. So data's only as good as what you do with it, right? I mean, if it's there, there's no reason for it to be there until you act on it. So talk us through these reports and some of the most important things that you think carriers can act on.
Yeah, and I would encourage carriers to go through, look at the data and see what is an actual action item that I can take from each survey question, from each data point in the data download. For example, we know drivers, we mentioned earlier, they're using YouTube more than any other app on their phone. What is your video strategy? Do you have a presence on YouTube? Do you have any awareness ads on YouTube as pre-roll ads for some of the videos that drivers are watching? I mean, it's just questions like that you ask yourselves, and I know I mentioned earlier, but you almost do an audit on, okay, do I have action behind what this data is telling me? And so I would really go through like that. I know we have a lot of clients that do that. I mean, we have some clients that are like, when is this coming out? And I'm like, hold on, we're working on it, But I think putting action behind it, you're right. It doesn't matter if you just, oh, wow, that's interesting. So
yeah,
you see that a lot.
I do. I mean, we do monthly calls with all of our folks and kind of walk through the data and what we're seeing and what we're hearing. What I would recommend to any carrier looking through at least the retention side of our reports is, again, kind of do that self-audit. Like, look at those issues, look at equipment issues, look at compensation issues. Do you have a way, or do you have a process in place right now that the answers to these questions? Are we doing something? Do we have a process to assign equipment the right way? Do we have a process to know? Do we have a truck that's continually going into the shop? Do we know how our communication standards are by our fleet managers? Do we have a way to measure that? If you don't, then I would look at that and say, okay, we either need to find a way, or they can call us and we'll help them. That's how I would recommend you look at the data is, do we have any blind spots here? Do I know the answer to my individual carrier right now to, are we communicating effectively with our drivers? Are we proactively communicating with our drivers? Do we have a way to know what our equipment is doing, how it's assigned? And do we know how to identify drivers who are struggling with miles right now? Because I'll tell you right now, if you have a driver that's struggling with miles right now, they're a high turnover risk. They just are. And so, do we have a way to identify those drivers? Do we have a way to jump in front of those issues? So that's how I would look at our data. If I'm getting that and I'm sitting behind the desk, are we doing these things? This is what drivers are talking about. It's their perception, but their perception is reality. And so it may not always be 100% accurate from a carrier standpoint, but it is 100% accurate from the driver's perspective. And so, do we have a way to measure that? Are we doing it? And do we have a process to fix it? And that's how I would look at that data.
And then one of my last questions is, I know we briefly touched on this earlier, in this specific market, what does it mean to carriers to recruit and retain drivers? In your conversations with carriers, what are they saying? And then what are drivers saying to match up with that?
Yeah, I think for us, it's just always goes back to like, how are you telling your story? Because that's what's important to the driver is the story that they're selling me and the story they're telling me about what it's like to drive for them actually what they're delivering on. And so I think for us, that's our challenge always, is how do we help you tell your story to the driver market? And it does impact recruiting and retention. I mean, obviously retention for sure. And so when we go in and we start working with the client, that's our first question is, what is your story? And unfortunately, a lot of carriers don't really know. Like, oh, you're a name, not a number. I've heard that, or the typical, we have an open door policy. Okay, well, what does that really mean? Like, tell me what that means. What does open door policy mean to you? And so for us, it just always goes back to, how you tell your brand, your employer brand's story. That's really
And
important.
our end of that is that story fiction or nonfiction to the driver? And so, the retention game is a real interesting game right now. We kind of talked about that a little bit earlier. Some carriers don't pay as much attention to it. Some carriers really do during a freight recession. So it's kind of an interesting time from a retention standpoint. But I think kind of building off what Priscilla said, our data is going to tell a carrier, is the story that they're telling fiction or nonfiction from the driver's perspective? And that's, I think, why our companies partnering together the way we do and looking at the data is going to tell you that story. Conversion uses our data to help a company form that story based on the driver feedback. We look at conversions data to go in and walk with a carrier and say, this is your story, this is the story you're telling, this is the story the driver's telling. So it really makes a lot of sense to look at that data from that standpoint.
Awesome. And then any other closing thoughts as we kind of wrap it up here?
Well, I think, Priscilla, you should tell them about our podcast. They can go listen to our podcast too, right?
Oh yeah, we do. We have the resource, and we talk about things like this. But we have guests on that really talk about recruiting and retention, and even folks that aren't in trucking, because we think it's important to kind of get that. But yeah,
and you never know what you might talk about on the podcast.
I
either,
know
right?
we do. We have a lot. We have a lot of fun. We have, we just had a really in-depth conversation about fast food breakfast before we kind of started recording today, and I'm pretty sure we're going to talk about that.
I think we absolutely should, because I'm right.
It's an important topic, especially as everyone's on the road this conference season.
Yes, it is. It is, and just chicken mini wins out is all I'll say for that.
Well, yeah. I mean, Chick-fil-A in general.
Yeah.
Wins out. But we talk about really cutting things like that, fast food. But I would invite people to tune in. We talk about data, but we also are going to talk to people, like Priscilla said, that are outside of the trucking industry, because I think one of the things that we can do from a transportation is learn. We can learn from how other people are doing things, because everybody has to recruit and everybody has to retain. They're going to do it differently. The population in which they're reaching into is going to be different, but there's definitely things that we can learn from other people, and that's one of the things that we wanted to do with this podcast, is get those other perspectives, see what we can learn, gather ideas, get best practices. We can talk about data, and then we can talk about a bunch of stuff that doesn't make a hill beans difference, but it's fun to talk about nonetheless.
Awesome. And then we have a recurring question we like to ask all of our guests. So if both of you want to share, what is your bold prediction for the future of the trucking industry?
Oh, bold prediction.
Got to make it spicy.
I would say, from a recruiting standpoint, I would say I really think that there's going to be some carriers who are not embracing technology that are not going to win in the driver market, even if they have solid brands. I think even if you have a solid brand and you don't have the technology behind you to recruit smarter, you're going to lose, because even those whose brands may not be as big in the market, but they're using the technology to recruit smarter, I think they're going to win out. And that is a little bit, the only reason I think that's bold is because a lot of people say, oh, well, the big brands are always going to win. But if the technology isn't there, I think we're really going to see some people slowed way down from a recruiting standpoint.
Yeah, so I guess mine, I don't know if it's a bold prediction, it's just a hunch that I have. So a lot of carriers during COVID went to a guarantee pay model. And I think that the guarantee pay model is going to go the way of the sign-on bonus. And here's what I mean by that. The sign-on bonus was such a big deal, and it is still to some. But what drivers have come to realize is that the sign-on bonus, when you see an advertisement for a $10,000 sign-on bonus, it doesn't mean the minute they walk in there, they get a check for $10,000 and say, welcome. What they realize is that sign-on bonus is paid out over time, right? So they may get $1,000 up front, but they got to stay there for 5 years to get the full 10. The guarantee pay model, I think, is going to go that same direction. And what I mean by that is everybody that's doing the guarantee, it's not a guarantee, it's a conditional. we will pay you X amount if you do A, B, C, and D during this week. You can't turn down any loads. You can't spend more than 34 hours at home. That's not a guarantee. That's conditional. Now, you go back to look at some of our data reports. Drivers, when they hear guarantee, they think your guarantee is $1,200 a week. On Friday, I'm getting a check for $1,200. Period. End of discussion. Full stop. And I think drivers are now slowly coming to the realization that guarantee is not guarantee, it's conditional. So I guess my bold prediction, I don't know when this is going to happen, but I think is that at some point the guarantee pay model is going to go the way of the sign-on bonus. It's going to lose its effectiveness eventually.
We'll have to have you back on in a while and check in on that prediction.
Only if
see
I'm
where
right.
That's going. So
Only if I'm
you're
right.
All right.
If I'm not,
that sounds
then
conditional to me.
It is conditional. Nicely done. Yes, that is conditional. Yes.
Well, awesome. It was great to have you both, and thank you for joining us for the podcast.
Thank you.
Hope you enjoy the Women in Trucking Conference.
Yeah.
And where can the listeners find you?
Yeah, you can find us at conversionia.com and also the resource.conversionia.com. That's where we have all this data that we talked about today. And the content is on the resource.conversionia.com.
Yep. You can find us at www.pdateam.com. We also have a link on our website with the resource on it where you can get all of our data reports, and you can also listen to and go download the podcast.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you all again. I appreciate the time.
Thanks.